We're going to be reading Who Were the Brothers Grimm by Avery Reed. This is a biography. A biography is a true story about a real person written by another person. So Avery Reed is the author of this book, but Avery Reed wrote the story about these two men, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. If you've ever heard a fairy tale, then you have heard a story that was probably written down for the first time by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And this is the true story of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's life. Before we start to read, in this video, I'll show you the table of contents. We're going to read Who Were the Brothers Grimm, which is actually an introduction, and then the first chapter, Best Friends, and then for every other video, we'll read 2 chapters for each other video. Before we begin reading Who Were the Brothers Grimm, I would like to introduce you to some vocabulary words you'll hear in the story. The first word is quest. A quest is a mission or a journey to complete a goal. And they'll tell you that most fairy tales include a quest. Evil, which is something dark and really bad. They'll tell you that in most fairy tales, the hero is trying to overcome an evil on his quest. Thrilled means really happy, and Jacob and Wilhelm's parents were thrilled when they were born. They were very happy to have 2 wonderful sons. Inseparable is when 2 people never like to be apart. They always like to be together. And they'll tell you that the brothers Grimm were inseparable. They like to stay together all the time and do things together. Slender means skinny or small. And the word slender is an adjective, a describing word, and they'll use the word slender to describe one of the brothers' physical appearance. Determined is when someone will not give up. They always keep trying. Determined is another adjective, and determined will describe one of the brothers. Conflict is a problem or a fight or an argument. So be listening for how they use the word conflict. Townspeople are just the people who live in a town. Disorderly means when people cause problems and do not follow rules. And it's interesting, this is an adverb, and they will use this adverb to describe a character in the book, but it might not be who you're thinking. So be sure to listen for the word disorderly and who the author, Avery Reed, tells us is disorderly in this book. And the last word is devastated. Devastated means very sad because of something bad that happened. And there is a devastating something that happens in the first chapter of this book. So be sure and listen for what made the characters very sad and what bad thing happened to devastate them. So we'll review those again at the end of the reading of chapter 1 and the introduction. Who Were the Brothers Grimm by author Avery Reed. And this book is a biography or a true story about these 2 brothers. Who Were the Brothers Grimm by Avery Reed, illustrated by John O'Brien. There are several illustrations. Here is the table of contents, and we'll be reading the introduction and the first chapter. Who were the Brothers Grimm? Once upon a time, an old peasant woman began, there was a queen whose husband had been dead for many years, and she had a beautiful daughter. A young man named Wilhelm Grimm listened attentively to the woman's story. The woman had likely heard it when she was a young child from her own mother. It was a German fairy tale called The Goose Girl. The fairy tale is about a magical charm, a horse who can speak, an evil servant, and a princess who was doomed to a life guarding geese for a king who believes she is a peasant. Wilhelm had traveled out into the countryside of Germany to meet Dorothea Weinmann and listen to her stories. She told him 35 tales, and Wilhelm wrote them all down word for word. It was 1813, and Wilhelm and his older brother Jacob were in the middle of a big project. The brothers had just published their first book together, a collection of German fairy tales, and now they were working on a second volume. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were serious scholars, but they loved listening to fairy tales. They thought children's stories were an important part of German history. We'll find out why in just a second. Here's a picture drawn by the illustrator to show us Jacob and Wilhelm, who were serious about learning lots of things in life, but especially about keeping the fairy tales from being forgotten. Because fairy tales had been told and retold for hundreds of years. The tales showed how German language and culture had developed. But by 1813, fewer and fewer people were telling fairy tales to their children. Soon, the Grimms feared no one would remember the stories. It was difficult for Jacob and Wilhelm to collect fairy tales because the stories were not in books. Before the Grimms, very few fairy tales had ever been written down. People only came to know a fairy tale because someone else had told it to them. The only way to collect the stories was to listen to storytellers like Dorothea, who knew them by heart. What makes a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a quest story that is almost always about a very lucky hero who overcomes evil. A fairy tale also usually involves magic. There are imaginary creatures such as fairies, giants, dragons, and elves. Sometimes there are even talking animals. A fairy tale is set a long time ago in a faraway place and usually begins with the phrase, "Once upon a time." No one knows who first created fairy tales. These stories have simply developed over time. Sometimes storytellers changed the stories slightly and added details as they went. Different versions of the same stories developed in different countries. In Germany, Snow White lived with 7 dwarves. Have you heard of the version of Snow White where she lives with 7 dwarves? But in Albania, she lived with 40 dragons. Mothers and nursemaids told fairy tales like Snow White to children while cooking dinner and sitting by the fire or before going to bed. Men and women also told these stories to one another while they worked, spinning wool or tending to their flocks. As Wilhelm listened to Dorothea's stories, he never imagined that he and his brother would become famous. All he knew was that they wanted to write down these tales. Wilhelm wanted new generations of children to know and love Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Tom Thumb, and Little Red Riding Hood as much as he did. So that's an introduction to why the Brothers Grimm wrote down the fairy tales that we have now. And now we'll begin the biography part of the story, where we find out about the true events and facts in Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's life, as told by someone other than themselves, the author Avery Reed. Chapter 1, Best Friends. Jacob Ludwig Karl Grimm was born on January 4th, 1785. Just 13 months later, on February 24th, 1786, his brother Wilhelm Karl Grimm was born. The boy's parents, Philip and Dorothea Grimm, were thrilled. So they were only about 1 year apart. And you can tell that they lived a long time ago because their clothes and their way they wore their hair is so different than the way we wear ours now. And also in a biography, the author almost always starts out by telling us about the date that the characters he's writing about were born. And so that's what we're seeing in this biography. At that time, there was no country called Germany, just a lot of German-speaking states that were part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Grimm family lived in a small town in the state of Hesse-Kassel. Philip Grimm worked as a lawyer and served as the town's clerk. Dorothea ran the household. You can see that because this was long ago, their house looked a little different, but still had a kitchen, but a stove where wood had to burn to make it hot. Probably a maid or a servant that worked in their house. Here are the boys. Maybe they had, I don't know if this is supposed to be a sister or another nursemaid, maybe younger children. She had 4 more children: Carl, Ferdinand, Ludwig, and Charlotte, who was called Lottie. 2 housemaids, Gretchen and Marie. So that answers our question. Gretchen and Marie are the housemaids. And here is Charlotte, the youngest, and the other children, Carl and Ferdinand, and then Jacob and Wilhelm. 2 housemaids, Gretchen and Marie, helped Dorothea cook and care for the children. Sometimes Gretchen would sneak the boys bread and cheese and tell them fairy tales. From an early age, Jacob and Wilhelm were inseparable. They slept together in one bed and studied at one desk. They pretended to hunt turkeys and spied on neighbors from their father's study window. There they are as little boys pretending to hunt turkeys using sticks or guns. And this page shows us a map of what now is Germany, but at the time you can see there's Russia and Hungary and France, but this area was part of the Holy Roman Empire. So kind of like the United States was part of the English Empire or British Empire, Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And I'll let you pause the video if you'd like to read this information about the Holy Roman Empire. Jacob was small and slender, but he was strong-willed and determined. Wilhelm was taller than Jacob and much more sensitive. He loved poetry and art. Both boys were smart and hardworking. You can see the boys in their school. They're smart and hardworking, and there's their teacher. Though they were bright and curious, Jacob and Wilhelm hated school. Jacob, who had read full newspaper articles from age 5, found their lessons very boring. Their teacher, Herr Zinkenhan, was also mean. If a student forgot his grammar book, Zinkenhan would give him a beating. Does your teacher ever beat you? I'm going to guess probably not. But this was a long time ago and in another place, and that's what their teacher would do if they forgot something. The Grimm family was very close. Jacob and Wilhelm helped take care of their younger siblings. Their Aunt Julianne taught the brothers to read and write. Their parents taught the children to be proud they were German and to trust in God in difficult times. In 1791, when Jacob was 6 and Wilhelm was 5, their father became the magistrate or judge in a nearby town. The Grimm family moved into a beautiful home with a huge lime tree out front. What do those look like? What do you think we're about to read about? Let's see. By 1792, war had broken out in France, and the countries surrounding France were pulled into the conflict. So this conflict was an argument in the country of France about what should be happening in the government. French soldiers wandered the streets near the Grimm's home. Dorothea did not allow Jacob and Wilhelm outdoors when the soldiers were nearby. The townspeople complained that the soldiers were disorderly. So it was the soldiers that were not following the laws and that were being difficult. This made Philip's job difficult, and he was often away from his family. So their dad had to take care of if the people thought the soldiers were difficult. That seems like a really hard and dangerous job. There's him as a magistrate, their dad Philip as a magistrate or a judge. Still, he was very active in the boys' lives, praying with them in the morning and asking them questions at dinner. Jacob and Wilhelm were very proud of their father, especially when he was wearing his judge's uniform. Then, on January 10th, 1796, 6 days after Jacob's 11th birthday, their father died suddenly. The Grimm family was devastated. Devastated means very sad because of something bad that happened. And they were devastated because their father died. Besides being so sad, they now had very little money. Dorothea could not work and raise 6 children on her own. One of the boys' aunts helped Dorothea around the house. She also arranged for Jacob and Wilhelm to study at a school near her home in the city of Kassel. The boys were sad to leave their mother and the siblings, but Dorothea insisted they go. This was their chance for a good education. So they went to live with their aunt so that they could go to a good school and learn lots of things. And that's the end of chapter 1. I hope you've enjoyed this first introduction and first chapter about the Brothers Grimm in a biography or a true story with true facts written about their life by Avery Reed. We're going to really quickly do the vocabulary again and see if you heard these vocabulary words while we were reading. Devastated means very sad because of something bad that happened, and the boys were devastated when their father died. Disorderly is when people cause problems and do not follow rules, and it was the French soldiers who were disorderly and the boy's father who had to be a judge and take care of them. Townspeople are the people who live in a town. Conflict is a problem, a fight, or an argument. And in this story so far, the conflict was in the country of France. They were having a war. Determined is when someone will not give up. They always keep trying. And that was a describing word that described one of the brothers. Slender means skinny or small, another adjective that described one of the brothers. Inseparable is when 2 people never like to be apart, and Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were inseparable. They liked to sleep in the same bed and study at the same desk and do all the same games together. Thrilled means really happy. That's how the boys' parents felt when they were born. Evil is something dark and really bad. There's usually an evil character in a fairy tale. And quest is a mission, a journey to complete a goal. And most fairy tales have a hero that's on a quest. So we hope you'll come back for video number 2 and read more about the Brothers Grimm in their biography.